what role is it playing in countering disinformation, especially in the UK? Joining us for this very important conversation today are Thomas Barton, the founder and executive director of CCOD, Professor Sander van der Linden, um, the world leading academic on disinformation and media literacy, and John Penrose, former government minister and member of parliament. Thank you all for joining us today and for driving this very important conversation. Uh, Thomas, I will begin first with you and ask what led to the establishment of the Council for Countering Online Disinformation, and if you could please shine some light on what its mission is.
Sure, and thank you, Remy, for hosting this session. It's great to have the chance to field questions from different people who take an interest in this topic. So I recently founded the Council for Countering Online Disinformation, as you say, and the reason for that is because disinformation is becoming a growing challenge. It's been around since the dawn of time, but due to the advances in AI technology, the scale and pervasiveness of the threat is increasing, and the Council therefore to convene an ecosystem of like-minded actors who are all developing solutions to tackle disinformation and to champion those solutions to the British government and parliamentarians, because we believe that there's an urgent need to take this issue more seriously and to implement a range of different solutions out there that we can help to leverage to address the problem. And to be honest, we need a convening actor to bring together all these diffuse organizations that are sort of working on great solutions to address disinformation, but they need to be coordinated because as I'm sure we'll come on to, there's no silver bullet to solving this issue. You need a holistic approach, and the best way to champion that is if you're bringing together an ecosystem of like-minded bodies. So hopefully give us some support leadership and some sensible policy recommendations that can really help support the British government in its effort to protect us all from the threat to information integrity that we face in the UK.
Thank you, Thomas. You said that misinformation and disinformation has been here since time immemorial. So I want to and open up the floor for your individual perspectives on this next question. So when we speak of misinformation and disinformation, we've always known that it has existed in some form or the other. It has been used as a warfare tactic. It has been used for political propaganda. So why should we be any more concerned now? What has changed? What is the immediate threat? John, I would love to begin with you. Yes,
I'll start. The others can add far more intelligent building on what I will start off with. But I mean,
Sander. Perfect. Please.
So the thing that's changed most recently is the advent of AI, but also before that, the development of the digital world and the digital economy. So those two things together, at an accelerating rate, have meant that it is easier and cheaper and more effective to spread lies, gossip, or things which might be true but you don't know if they are, than it ever has been before. So before it was an expensive, slow process, and even though the old saying that the lie is halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on is an old phrase, it's actually much more true now because of those two things. And AI is, as I said, is an accelerating process. AI is making it day by day cheaper and faster and harder to spot as well. So those are the things that's making it more acute. It's an old problem, but it's a new, bigger problem as well.
Thank you. Yeah, Sander.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I would say that the nature of human technology interaction has just changed fundamentally. For my book, I actually calculated how long it took in the Roman Empire to diffuse a message from on a carriage, a horse and carriage, and actually it would take at least a week to get some serious mileage on a rumor. And so, rumors also spread from village to village, but it took a long time. And I think now, obviously with the click of a button, we can send a rumor to millions, if not hundreds of millions of people all at once. The barriers to entry in terms of news production have been lowered completely. So we're moving from a world where there was top-down legacy media communication to a bottom-up influencer model, people with no credentials, no affinity for accuracy or truth can say anything online, and it can reach anyone. And we know that it reaches millions of people, amplified by personalized algorithms, right, that scrape our personal data, our digital footprints, to then tailor that information to us. I mean, the psychology of that is just very different from how people are used to engaging with information, right? We're used to talking face to face, and we can read other people's facial expressions really well in generally, unless you have a deficit in social cognition. But usually, we're able to discern pretty well, which is just much harder on the internet. It's anonymous. You can be tricked much more easily, right? You can be exploited by bot armies, by inauthentic activity. I mean, a majority of activity online, as John was saying, is now AI powered. But the amount of inauthentic activity is growing. Coordinated inauthentic activity, masked activity. You don't know who you're dealing with. Could be an LLM, could be a bot, could be a person. So the old sort of saying, "Seeing is believing," I think is no longer true. At some point, the beginning of the internet and social media, there were sort of critics who said, okay, but exposure doesn't equal infection, right, or persuasion. So just because we're exposed more, if you look at the data, in the 60s, about a third of people believed in a conspiracy theory in terms of population numbers, about a third of the population. That's still true today. And so they were a bit skeptical, saying, well, actually, maybe more people are exposed, but not all of them are also true believers. But I think with the advent of AI, I think that's changing, because knowing what to believe and whom to trust is becoming much more difficult. And research shows people struggle with deepfakes. People do no better than chance in terms of discerning inauthentic from authentic activity. So unfortunately, I think that the probability that we're getting duped by inauthentic content, by disinformation, not just exposed, it's just going up quickly as we're grappling with how to deal with these new technologies. And then the last thing I'll say is that it's so fragmented now. Our information infrastructure, it's hugely fragmented. People are on different social media. We're on LinkedIn right now. Other
Yeah.
people are on Snapchat, WhatsApp, Instagram. Right? It's so fragmented into different epistemic communities that it becomes harder to communicate with one another. And that also means it becomes harder to get corrective information through the echo chambers that might be consumed by false information. And so that presents, I think, another challenge in terms of differences of the information landscape from what it used to be.
Thomas, what would you like to add?
Well, no, I think there's some important points to be made by John and Sander. I think for me, when I think about the threat of disinformation, and I'm glad Sander mentioned his research, his book on how information traveled in ancient Rome. I mean, this stuff has been around forever. Octavian, his power struggle when Julius was assassinated, Mark Antony literally used sort of a disinformation campaign to discredit Mark Antony. He said he was raising an army in Egypt. He was going to subject the Roman Empire to foreign credentials to dismiss his claim to being the heir to Caesar. So this stuff has been around forever. The democratize, and there are benefits to that, but there are also risks. We've democratized who can actually broadcast information. I mean, just if you go back a couple of decades ago, consume their information from in the UK, at least, from traditional broadcasters. It consume the local telecom news. Those broadcasters have to abide by the broadcasters' code, regulatory environment in place. Whereas now, when you look at young people in particular, they're getting all their information from TikTok and Instagram and so forth, and as a result, they're being exposed to information that is on platforms where they disproportionately rely for news consumption. I mean, when it comes to AI, there's obviously these scalability aspect where you can now, on the cheap, produce a lot of low quality false content at scale, and it's not incredibly for people, and it then makes them sort of very cynical and pushes them off platform. But also, you can produce very high quality false content. So there's been recent academic research that's found that synthetic false tweets, so tweets written by AI, are 3% more compelling at misinforming than human authored alternatives. So AI changes things at both ends of the scale. It could put a lot of cheap crap to really disrupt. They could also highly sophisticated false content that's actually better than what human authors can produce. So yeah, it is a concern, but not lost, because AI can actually, as I'm sure we'll come to later, also be part of the solution here when it comes to detecting disinformation. So it's not necessarily just the negative. It can actually help us to address this threat.
Thank you, Thomas. And I would like to follow up with another question, because we've been talking about platforms. So, do you think that now more than ever, the onus lies on these platforms to do fact checking? Or can they always shy away because it's a public platform and people have freedom of speech and expression?
I mean, I can come in first quickly and then pass on to John and Sander if you'd like. So I mean, fact checking is interesting because it's fallen out of favor. We've seen recently that Meta has reduced its funding for fact checking.
Yes.
I think I might focus a bit more on the fact checking element, if I may, and then maybe John and Sander want to talk about the responsibilities of the platforms themselves and where their responsibility starts and stops, and where potentially government should be coming in and regulating
Yes.
Ofcom. But just on the fact checking side. Look, I think fact checking has its merits, but we can't rely on fact checking alone to properly address the growing threat of information. I think that's an insufficient response to the challenge. I mean, fact checking, first of all, is by default you're having to sort of react to specific content forms. So rather than tracking threat profiles of malicious actors, you're sort of stuck in the weeds of how to respond to various content. So which content do you pick to fact check, and which content do you decide not to prioritize? So I personally prefer which is slightly more content agnostic, and on clamping down on the accounts of the actors themselves who are pumping out a lot of false content. Yeah, and then with fact checkers in general. Look, there is an ecosystem of them. Got some great fact checkers that operate in the UK, like Full Fact, but I think we do start to realise there are other solutions at play here. So traditional form of, I say traditional, this is also new. There's no such thing as traditional AI detection tools, but the first way AI detection tools would actually focus on text-based assertions, and then the AI would sort of map content on social media against a database of text-based assertions to determine if that information is true or false. And the rise of fact-checking site data, right? And actually, we've now seen that there's been a shift away from that more sort of arcane approach, if I may call it that, toward using AI detection that's sort of identifies threat actor profiles, that maps false narratives online, and then sort of tries to deliver real counter-narrative sort of responses. So I think given the AI detection tools are evolving in a way relying on fact-checking the databases, I think that shows a clear direction of travel, and that fact-checking alone can't be the solution to this challenge. As well, the problem with fact-checking is that it's the onus on the individual sometimes. So it's suggesting that it's for the to have to sort of run things through a fact checker, and we do take more responsibility. I don't get myself into trouble with Sander here. Obviously, he's been leading a lot of research internationally on how we can help individuals to navigate the information environment. But I do think that we shouldn't leave this to individuals alone. For others to get involved with that, I'll let John Sander share on who should help to address this problem.
Sander, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think fact checking is important, but as Thomas said, it's clearly not enough. It's too, it's too late in the game. Often, it's reactive, not proactive. But it's funny because it's such a low hanging fruit to do. So the fact that they're getting worked up about fact checking, which is actually producing more words and more context, more speech, should be applauded by protectors of freedom of speech in a way, because it's all about producing more speech. I do think there's a sort of sensitivity around bias, but I think it's really important that we have fact checkers from across the political spectrum. I mean, everyone should be interested in truth and facts, and we should have representation from fact checkers, across the spectrum. I mean, there's just, let's take an example from a certain UK politician who might claim that people are eating swans in public parks. Right, the
Who do you
Royal
mean? Who do you mean,
Parks.
Xander? Name names.
No, not if
The
you're not.
Royal Parks fact checked this claim and said, there's no evidence, there's nobody doing that. Why can't we all just rally around the fact? If that wasn't enough, the police then had to investigate, who also came to the conclusion that there was no incidents. There was a photo circulating online. Turns out somebody took a picture with the bird, and the photo was used out of context on social media to produce a propagandistic claim. And I think that's the challenge that we're all facing. And that's why I do think that real-time fact-checking or tools like community notes sometimes can be helpful, because they provide the context and say, look, the police have investigated and actually turns out this is an out-of-context photo. You should proceed with caution, right? And that's not intruding on anyone's free speech. It's just providing more context. So I think it's useful for that purpose, but obviously it's not enough. Now, I think with respect to regulation, I mean, to some extent, it depends on your political preferences, right? For the role of private companies in society. But my view is, if you look at the evidence, and there's been a lot of documentation of what goes on inside these companies, and if they are knowingly allowing harms to be produced, that's generally not something that society as a whole prefers to tolerate. I mean, look at false advertising, right? There's bipartisan support for regulations on false advertising. Nobody likes that. If you look at, online harms with regards to children, a lot of these platforms have, AI engaging in inappropriate talk with children, for example, as an online harm. Most people across the political spectrum, think that that's a bad thing. So why not the same for disinformation, in the sense that, there is harmful information that has, imminent potential to produce harm. And if that goes unchecked on social media platforms, they might say that they're not an arbiter of truth, but they do have a responsibility as a corporate citizen to make sure that their product is safe for people to use. I mean, we applied those standards in all other areas of industry. So I don't see why social media companies should be exempted from having to do quality control over the content that they put out. Some people make this sort of analogy with the public good, which of course this is not. But if you think of it as a river and somebody keeps polluting the river, why should it be people's job to clean it up? And they can say, well, if you want to use the river, it's up to you. So I guess, in this case, the social media company is not a public service, not a public good. It's a private company, and private companies can do what they want within the confines of the law. But I think the problem is that they're not actually enforcing their own policies, right? So there should be independent regulators like Ofcom who go on and see, well, you have hate speech policies, you have misinformation policies, but they're actually not enforcing them. If you go on any of these platforms, you'll see that there's content on there that shouldn't be on there, right? And so I think it's about accountability and independent regulators making sure that companies inform their own policies to make sure that people can use these platforms safely. And of course, they can rebut by saying, well, then don't use our platform if you don't like it. There's a free market. But there's, as we know, the invisible hand produces negative externalities, in the sense that they can produce outsized harms for some groups. And there needs to be some balance. I mean, it's hard to think of situations where you have completely unregulated markets where there's no harm coming to some people, right? In terms of somebody producing a good that is not negatively affecting somebody else. And hence, that's why most industries are regulated. And the fact that social media companies are resisting regulation so hard, I think is interesting. What are their motivations? What are their incentives? And if you look at all the documentation that's been produced, it seems that they know about these harms, that they're hiding, suppressing them, and they don't want to take action. We've seen that with the tobacco industry, with firearm industry, with other industries, and that's been documented. There's been legal cases. and they've been found guilty of doing that. And I suspect much of the same is going on here. But I'll pass it to John because he has much more experience with corruption and regulation than I do.
Well, thank you, Xander. And just to build on some of that, I mean, I would. One of the things that the CCOD is going to be doing is putting out some position papers, and one of the things that we will have to discuss internally is, I think there's a really important debate to have about whether or not we want to try and argue that internal rules for platforms about hate speech, etc., should be given legal force externally or not. I'm not at all sure that's right. Xander, very, very serious and learned professor, has just been saying he thinks there's some merit in that. That's one of the really knotty issues which CCOD is going to be addressing, and we're going to have to address because it's crucial to free speech. So park that one for 1 second. I just think that to sum up what we've been hearing so far, I think there are two issues here. You started off with a question about fact checkers. So there's fact checking and accuracy, factual accuracy, and then there's bias and balance. If you're focusing on the first of those two to begin with, fact checking is really vital. It's absolutely essential, but it's very slow. And so what we need to have is an ecosystem which says, look, there are independent journalistic standards for factual accuracy. They aren't driven by governments, they aren't driven by politicians, they are international standards about what counts as factually accurate reporting or not. So let's not try and reinvent those. In fact, I think it's quite dangerous for politicians to try and reinvent those, because you can just imagine President Putin deciding he's going to have his own definition of factual accuracy, thank you very much, and it can be whatever he thinks that morning. So it's better to apply those standards of factual accuracy. And at that point, you need two things. One is you need the upstream thing, which both Thomas and Xander's been talking about, which is real-time checking to say, how many other reputable people are saying that there's been a small earthquake in Chile or in China or wherever it might be? Is this true? Or is this likely to be true? And you need to be able to do that in real time, because if you put the onus on individuals, when we're all seeing 20 things as we scroll through our feeds in a minute or more, there's no way we're going to do those checks. It's just not going to happen. We're going to accept it or not as it goes past us, and that's far too weak. Ditto, I'm afraid. Community notes on their own, they are a good thing in principle, but they are far too weak. They didn't, for example, stop the spread of disinformation around the Southport riots recently. So you've got to have something that works in real time. That's got to be AI. It's got to be based on these kind of international factual accuracy standards. But then you do need either people or AI or some combination of the two going back retrospectively and saying, right, if that was wrong, was it right, was it wrong? Because that is how you build a cadre of trusted sources which you need to do the real-time comparisons. Yeah, because if you have a series of trusted sources who always adhere to these international, try to always adhere to these international standards for factual accuracy, then they're the ones you go and check on against in real time. So when someone says there's been an earthquake in Chile, if other people who are reputable are also saying that, then it increases the chances in real time that is a valid judgment to take. That's why it's, so the answer to your question, I mean, is yes, it is vital, but it isn't enough on its own, but it is an essential foundation block. And if you haven't got it, then it makes the real-time assessments a great deal harder and less reliable.
Thank you so much for your perspectives. I think I will extend this conversation on a bit, because there's a really good question that's come in from Blaine along these lines. And he says, battling disinformation is a war on many fronts, from legislative and regulatory measures to journalistic integrity and public awareness. So I want to understand from your standpoint, which approach do you believe holds the strongest potential for effectively countering disinformation, and why do you think so?
Can I chime in quickly just to say all of them? I think this is an and, not an or.
Absolutely, I would agree.
We will need these things at different points in the journey, but we're going to need all those weapons to counter different blocks. Because the question is entirely right. It's a really broad topic, and it covers everything. All those examples. So we're going to need all of them. But I mean, Thomas and Xander may be able to sort of moderate my enthusiasm in some more intelligent way.
I mean, I would forth, John, because I completely agree, and I spend my time regularly saying that we need a genuine sort of holistic approach. We want the sort of the bottom up, sort of longer term generational change that comes with what Sander has been doing with his research as a literacy, making sure that young people are taught early on how to think critically about information and discern between what's true and what's false. Because then, even if the online giants continue to evade regulatory intervention and oversight, then the argument as much, because if the individual is able to determine what's true and what's false, then actually they better to navigate a polluted information environment. But you need to combine that with sort of top-down action as well, which comes with regulatory change. What you can do around in the CCOD, you're talking about this at length. There's a lot you can do on the regulatory side that could be actually amenable to big tech, right? It's not necessarily about sort of undermining traffic and content on their feeds and engagement from people. It's about making sure engaging with content that's actually reliable and accurate. But I give a bit of a cop-out response and focus on the political opportunity window, because I think sometimes you have to be led by that, right? I mean, you need an Overton window of opportunity sometimes to really achieve change. At the moment, whether the government wants to pursue greater regulatory intervention, if it had the appetite to say strengthen sort of the Prevention Online Safety Act to address disinformation, which are pretty lackluster so far, to say that the Downing Street kids, I would struggle to politically garner support for that, because the White House is putting a lot of pressure on countries like the UK not to regulate these American social media giants. And indeed, we did a few months ago. President Trump and his team were sort of trying to attach preferential tariffs in trade negotiations with the British government to the possibility of watering down implementation of the Online Safety Act. So the British government is and I don't often government to do. They are constrained. So I would argue that in the time of constraint, we should look to what the private sector and civil society have developed, because solutions are much more sort of them implement. They're sort of ready-made, oven-ready, in a political phrase. And I've been in recent weeks since I launched the CCOD, traveling the length and breadth of the underground system, and I've been sort of tiny pioneering AI British startup companies and all talking to big American AI companies. I've met with charities, non-profit, academics at leading universities, and actually there's a lot of good stuff happening, right? Where government has failed to lead the way, the private sector and civil society have actually stepped in, and they've come up with and Sander's done a lot of work in this space, but they've come up with initiative with gamified approaches to help people to engage with media literacy tools and think that more critically about the information they consume. You've got these technology startups that use a range of action try and map out campaign that are helping businesses and industry realize that they can commercially actually suffer from disinformation that can harm the commercial performances of entire industries, that can have a huge knock-on effect on the economy. So there's good stuff actually being developed at the moment, and I think that these sort of initiatives led by businesses, by charities, by non-profits, by academics and so forth are part of the solution, whilst we wait for that political window of opportunity to present itself, then add to that great activity going on at the moment, more regulatory intervention. But so much that the government can do just around providing more funding for initiatives. I'll just quickly finish with the point around funding, actually, before passing the microphone to Sander. DCIT, Department for Science and broad department in Whitehall that's responsible for the area, although there's a lack of government of different departments are chiming in. But they've got a £16 billion annual research and development budget, and in 2023 to 2024, the latest financial accounts we've got for how that budget's been spent, only 2 million pounds has been provided for initiatives. And that £2 million of funding has been given to 17 different groups. So you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that a few breadcrumbs for a handful of organizations. There's a lack of government funding to try and support organizations that deliver public goods solutions. I think there could be a lot more done. I know it's what and on the spending tabs, but they can be more done by government just by way of funding, creating incentive for private companies and non-profit organizations who are actually are in the public good, help address misinformation. So that's a really important.
Thank you so
absolutely.
much. Yes.
Sorry, where were you?
No, please, Sandra.
No. Yeah, no. I mean, I totally agree with both perspectives. I mean, it's interesting because I'm a psychologist, so I work on people. So there's often the assumption that there's a thing in behavioral science called the I and the S frame. The I stands for the individual, and the S stands for the system. And there's been some sort of critique that behavioral scientists focus too much on the individual and not on the system. I mean, I think it's a valid point in the sense that we sort of have this bias of working on individuals, but I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't appreciate the power of regulation sometimes. And it's interesting because some people are critical of regulation, might have concerns about free speech and so on, but I don't, in an ideal world, my view is like, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't need any regulation, right? If people just wouldn't share false information as much, if people wouldn't call each other nasty names, point their finger towards other groups. I mean, in an ideal world, we don't need any regulation because we can regulate ourselves. And we're all empowered to spot manipulation and help others avoid it. But unfortunately, that just isn't always the case. And I think it's partly because the information environments that we find ourselves in are being shaped by technology companies in ways that are not transparent for people, right? The algorithmic filtering and prioritization capitalizes on human biases, exploit human biases, sometimes in the worst ways, where people, some of the worst features of human interaction emerge in those conversations online. People might not even know about it. If you look at Instagram, I've been in several meetings with Instagram, and one of the things I point out is that we look at the behavioral evidence. People, when they're in flame wars, when they're shouting at each other, right there, it sends a behavioral signal that you want to do this, so you get more of it. But then when you ask people through a survey about their preferences, they don't want any of that. And so, we're all fallible humans. So I think we all have good intentions, and we can have the best of skills, which is what I work on. But then when you put people in an environment where the incentives are overwhelmingly against you, or actually try to, work not with you, but against you in some way, then it's actually hard for people to implement their good intentions, right? And things go off the rails. And that's why I think regulation can help. And there's a synergy too. I mean, a lot of the regulation, for example, in the European Digital Services Act, has a clause on very large online platforms that they should be doing something about disinformation. And one of the things they advise is some of the interventions that we work on. And so if we can't get companies to voluntarily adopt them and say, let's help people be better consumers, then you can have regulation that says, look, you need to be doing something, otherwise you're going to get fined, and then give them the opportunity to select evidence-based strategies. And so I think there's this sort of synergy. And same with Ofcom. One of the problems they have in acting is that they need documentation of, when there's an online conversation happening or online event, how does that lead to offline harm? Like, what's the process, and how does it go from one company to another? What's the role of that company, right? So they have people working there, right? But they don't have necessarily the manpower to document all of these, all of the pathways in which digital harms leads to violence. But they need those pathways in order to then go to companies and say, this is how you're causing harm, this is how it needs to be fixed. And I think we can play a role in providing evidence for those pathways as scientists, as academics, thinking of myself. But yeah, certainly, I think you need regulation is important. But I will say it is tricky. We have a new tool that we're working on, which is charting the online manipulation market, which looks at how costly it is to buy inauthentic accounts online on every major platform in different countries. And one of our hopes is that when you see that happening, you can try to intervene. So, for example, if it's cheap in a certain country to buy fake accounts in advance of an election, you could try to drive up the price of inauthentic activity, which you could do by making SIM cards more expensive, because you often need SIM cards to get a burner phone in order to create fake accounts, right? So you could drive up the price of SIM cards. But then in some authoritarian countries, people use these tools to get information that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get, right? Because they're an authoritarian regime. So their only way is through this gray market where they create fake accounts in order to get information from the World Wide Web. So there's always a sort of consequence to regulation, and it's it is hard to find the right balance. In the Instagram meetings, they say, okay, so if we shouldn't optimize for engagement, what should we optimize for? And some people say education, but then and being a private company say, sure, we can optimize for educational material, but then nobody engages with it long enough, so then we don't have any advertisers, and then we don't make any money. And so, what should they be optimizing? What should the algorithms be optimizing for that doesn't lead to toxicity, polarization, and extremism, but still offers a viable business model? And I think regulation can serve to sort of thread that needle between preserving everybody's rights, right, to make a profit, but also to be free from harms and manipulation.
Some very important points there, Sander. Thank you. I will take one last audience question, and I think this is very relevant. This has come from Charlotte, and she says, do you think that public trust has a role to play in an organization's ability to tackle disinformation? And what I think she means by organization, it could be a legislative body, it could be these tech companies, and so on and so forth. What would your take on this be?
Can I begin there? Sorry.
Yes.
So high trust societies, high trust economies, high trust organizations generally work better. They are just practically more effective than places where you constantly have to be looking over your shoulder or lawyering up before you interact with anybody else. So the transaction cost of low trust is very high, and it has huge knock-on effects on economic growth rates, on commercial success, on democratic credibility and legitimacy. So broadly speaking, yes, the answer to the audience question is yes, it's really, really vital, but it isn't something that you can legislate for and say, that thou shalt trust this organization rather than that. Clearly, it's earned, not bestowed, if I can put it that way. And so, therefore, the thing which I think the council is going to have to work really carefully on is just understanding what are the components of that go to earn trust, and making sure that those apply not just to democratic bodies and legislative bodies, but also to things like companies. If you want to trash a company's reputation, you're going to have huge economic costs to that, and people are going to lose their jobs. And if you can do that really easily, as we've been saying earlier on, and very, very cheaply, then we've got to be able to prevent that. How do you create trustworthy sources of information to stop that happening? That, I think, is the crucial thing. And therefore, I regard public trust, it's kind of like it's an outcome rather than an input. If you get everything else right, then public trust will rise. But I think if you start off by saying, right, trust is the thing that we must legislate for, that's not going to work. It's the outcome, it's the result. It's like profit at a company. If you get everything else right with serving your customers will flock to you and will come back. And therefore you become more and more profitable and you grow. But if you start off by saying, how can we make most money, rather than how can we delight our customers, you ain't going to get very far.
Yeah, I will add to that. I think that's a key point. some research that we did here with my colleague David Spiegelhalter was all about this idea that trust isn't kind of a marketing sort of aim. It's an outcome of you have to demonstrate trustworthiness over periods of time in order to become a trusted actor. I think that's a really key point. That's true for government. That's true for industry. And there's just a lot of loss of trust. I think in some spaces, trust in government, trust in journalism, trust in each other. And part of the aim of disinformation sometimes is actually to disrupt trust, right? Because as John was saying, high trust societies do extremely well. They're very resilient. If you look at Finland, one of the key things to their success is people trust the media, they trust institutions, they have very high trust in all the sectors. And so disinformation often seeks to disrupt trust through polarization, through both effective and political polarization, right? And if you look at the indicators in the US and sometimes in the UK too, when people stop trusting each other, when they stop trusting politicians, when they stop trusting the media, I was going to say, I guess trust in politicians is always fluctuated, but I think the point is that there are principles of how to be an authentic and trustworthy actor, right? If you sell a product, you are authentic if you would buy it yourself. If you wouldn't buy the product yourself and you're selling it to other people, that's not being an authentic sort of salesperson, right? And so there are these principles that organizations and institutions need to adhere to, and we see that a lot with science communication. That if you go out and say one thing and then it becomes another, people lose trust. And there was a time where I felt for social media companies a little bit. So they were trying to share data, for example. Meta has shared data with us, with other research groups. And then they go out a year later saying, oh, actually, it was only half the data. We forgot that there was this other half, right? And that just, creates a sphere of distrust, right? Is that an accident or were they actually hiding it? Because when you put it together, it turns out the data actually tells a less promising story of what's going on. And that sort of fuels distrust, right? For all of the things about Elon Musk, and I'm not a fan of Elon Musk by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought it was interesting he made the X algorithm open source, right? It was about transparency. That's how people found out he was boosting his own account, right? But then you can be held accountable because you've been transparent, and I do think that's worth something, even though the outcome for the person doing the transparency might not always be good, but I think people should appreciate that when you are being transparent, you can be held accountable, and that's a good thing in itself. And so when it comes to social media companies, for example, we need transparency and we need accountability, and that's how you build trust.
Thanks.
No, I agree. I agree with everything that's been said. I'm glad Charlotte's raised the point on trust. I think it's such a vital one. And in my view, disinformation can sort of manifest itself in harmful ways. During a global pandemic like COVID, if you've got false information about vaccine, reduce uptake, lead to public health harms, or John was alluding to the commercial implications of disinformation. I could pretend to be a CFO of a FTSE 100 British company, and at Q3 trading, I can sort of use a fake and impersonate that CFO and put out false information that manipulates the market and tank the share price of that company. So that big ways you can define in real instances the corrosive information. But one of the most harmful ways in which disinformation manifests itself is in the long-term erosion of social trust. And that's so hard to quantify, and yet it's the most sort of pervasive aspect of it, in my view. And actually, if we want to therefore maintain social trust, which is actually critical to healthy public political discourse, right? Which I would bedrock of an open society. You often hear from people who are concerned by free speech and upholding that action on disinformation somehow amounts to undermining free speech. Well, I would take the view actually that if we're removing threats to information integrity, harm social trust, then actually we can promote sort of healthy public political discourse. That in turn will be the amplification of free speech. If I think that blue is blue and Remy, you think blue is red, that's not exactly. You can have a conversation because I can't agree on what the established facts are. One concern that I personally have is the particular effect of misinformation on younger people. I mean, it affects all of society, but I'm concerned about the effect on young people. And we've seen Ofcom's annual news consumption surveys that 16 to 24 consume information from TikTok and Instagram where there is more misinformation. I think it's interesting that that same age group are politically disillusioned. There's a 10% decrease in vote turnout amongst 18 to 24-year-olds from 2019 UK general election to the 2024 general election. Now, again, a lot of things could have gone into that, right? But there was a drop off. And research has recently found that amongst that same age group, a full 20% of them, a fifth of that age group, now no longer don't engage in our democracy through voting at the ballot box. They're actually entirely disillusioned with our political system, democratic government. And a fifth of that age group, according to this research, would rather have an automatic, unelected leader in the UK than use our parliamentary system of parliamentary representative democracy. So this disillusionment is really growing, and it's sort of going at the core of whether we believe in actually believe in having a democratic model of government. And correlation versus causation, always hard. It's proven to have that debate. But I think it's interesting that those young people who are disillusioned are also consuming information in a space that is disproportionately polluted by false content. And I think that's a really important point to make. Therefore, is that if we want to ensure people aren't sort of cynical and outright rejecting our democratic system, that young people can actually have trust in the information that they're consuming. That might help, as part of the solution of making sure that young people have their faith restored and that they re-engage in our political system. So I think, it's a very important question. I'm glad that Charlotte has the issue.
Thank you all for your perspectives. Do we have time for another question, or should we wrap this up? Because this is a really interesting question. I would love your final remarks on this one, and then we can close.
Well, we can't say no. Given that trail, we can't possibly say no, given that trail, really.
Okay, thank you so much. So this one is from Lindsay, and she says, the UK government has taken several steps to address disinformation. How well is the British government's current response keeping pace, and where should policy or regulation go next?
That is a very hard question to answer quickly, but I'll give a very succinct response and then pass on to John and Sandra. So I think if you're looking to sort of mark the British government's homework when it comes to foreign interference, so information being led by rogue state actors to try and undermine election integrity, actually the government of the last election did in place to monitor for that. But beyond that approach, and I'll defer to Sandra and John views in a moment as well. I personally take the view, and this is on 5 law, that the government's response has been insufficient. You look at the Online Safety Act; it makes scant references to mis- and disinformation. In fact, you know what the toughest measures in the Online Safety Act is for mis- and disinformation in the UK? It will compel Ofcom, the media, to set up an advisory committee to publish a report 8 months after that committee was established, looking at the mis- and disinformation threats. And the committee was only established in April of this year, a full year and a half after the legislation was passed into law. So, I mean, it's just, you don't need a report at the threats. The problem is really this great just happened to show how the problem manifests itself. We need to be in the solution phase. So I think that the government needs to be doing far more around media literacy and remaking the curriculum. There's a curriculum happening at the Department for Education. We need media literacy to be baked into that curriculum from the Nordic countries earlier. The Finns teach their kids think critically about information from the age of 4. Before they do that, and we're not doing anything at all. So we need to make sure that wholesale reform to the education curriculum to bed in critical thinking into traditional subjects and have other teaching media literacy, and we need to combine that with proper funding and also public contract opportunities for British startups and SMEs who are developing technology solutions to detect mis and disinformation. That should be part of the solution too, and we need to start looking at proper or serious regulatory interventions that can protect the sort of commercial interests of social media companies, whilst at the same time ensuring that more is done to help you protected from algorithms that are pumping out content that involves and put echo chambers. I think the UK on all fronts can go further, and if we could start to have something like the ESA effect, that would also already be sort of raising the bar if we still followed the EU approach. So yeah, a lot more done, and that's why the CCOD is there to promote the range of quite practical solutions that are out there that can help mitigate the threat, and that's what we'll be championing over the months and years to come.
Sander,
Yeah,
would you
I'll
like?
be relatively brief, and then I'm sure John has things to say. Yeah, I think there's a couple of points. One is I support the recommendation from the House of Lords recent inquiry on media literacy that the government needs to appoint a single minister who's going to be responsible for coordinating a new response to media literacy in the UK. I think, as Thomas said, we need to roll this out, with trials in schools nationwide to have the best evidence-based curriculum that we can. I mean, Finland is doing it. It's not entirely clear to me how they're evaluating it and what the evidence base is, but we should be doing that here in the most rigorous way possible. And that requires funding as well. So the government should be funding independent research into disinformation and how to counter it. They should be appointing a minister who's responsible for the media literacy strategy nationally, who can work with the Department of Education, Housing, other departments. Two is coordination. I just feel, in my work with MOD or with police chiefs or with the cabinet office, there's just a lack of coordination between different arms of government on who is responsible for disinformation, extremism at different levels. There needs to be a national coordination happening on how to respond to disinformation threats between all the departments for whom that might be relevant. And on regulation, yes, I would say that as Thomas said, the Online Safety Act doesn't reference misinformation. It does reference disinformation as it relates to elections, which is one thing. But ideally, it would be amended to include misinformation. The political landscape for that seems too complicated at the moment to make that happen. But I do think it should be amended to include misinformation. But you can see from the advisory committee that was established, that Thomas mentioned, they've actually renamed that advisory committee from Misinformation Advisory Committee to Information Committee because of the political sensitivities around the topic, which I see not as a good sign in terms of things to come. Although Ofcom has been acting on was it 4chan, I believe, and is currently embroiled in a lawsuit from the US when trying to enforce. They're going after the lowest hanging fruit, right? 4chan is the dumpster of the internet. There's a lot of actual harm, sex trafficking, illegal markets, a lot of bad things happening that are low-hanging fruits for them to address, rather than focus on something gray area like misinformation. But at least they're doing something. But yeah, I'm curious to see what will happen. So pass it over to John, who's much more experienced, of course, with government. And I don't know if that makes you more pessimistic or optimistic, John.
I think the answer to that question, I'm afraid, Sandra, is both, because look, I mean, the Online Safety Act does some really, really important things around child safety online and so on. And
Yes.
we shouldn't diss the Online Safety Act for what it doesn't do when it does some very important things as well. But it does them addressing different problems than the one we're talking about today. And so when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, Thomas is absolutely right. There are some important steps that have been taken, but we're kind of 3 out of 10. We're in the foothills still here. There's an enormous amount more that needs to be done. I'm not sure I'd take the European legislation as my guiding star, Thomas. I think there's a longer conversation for us to have there. But the fact that nobody else, no other free society, has yet successfully managed to both deal with mis and disinformation and at the same time preserve free speech and come up with a sustainable, comfortable equilibrium point yet, shows you how difficult this is. And I don't think that we can duck it just because it's hard. I don't think we can duck it because nobody else has dealt with it either. We will have to forge a new path here, and that's what the centre is set up to do. And I think that, as I said, we've made a very good start, but let's not kid ourselves as that there isn't an awfully long way still further to go. I gave us 3 out of 10 at the start of this. Perhaps I should start saying we're the one-eyed man in the land of the blind. We've got to grope an awful lot further before we get to the end of this journey.
Thank you so much, John, Sander, and Thomas, for your perspectives today. And I hope that we continue this dialogue going on. I want to also thank our audience for these really, really relevant and significant questions. And we would like to reconvene at some other point and then continue this dialogue. Thank you so much for being here. Have a lovely rest of the day.